This is a recreation of the sermon from January the 13th, 2013 at St. Paul United Methodist Church, Pastor Richard Brown II. This will be a recreation of the sermon for that Sunday with the readings as well. First reading is from Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 38. When the time had come for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn must be consecrated to the Lord. And to offer up a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. And there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought the child Jesus to him, for what was the custom of what the Lord required, Simeon took him up in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. And a sword will pierce your own soul too." There was also a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She lived with her husband 7 years after their marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to the Lord and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Israel. Second lesson comes from Luke 2, verses 41 through 52. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of this. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and at his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I would be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and people. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Churches. They come in all shapes and sizes. They can be new or old. They usually include some things like stained glass windows, pews, a variety of musical instruments, pianos, organs, and the like. You usually hope to see a pastor up there, a pulpit maybe, an altar, and we all hope that there are plenty of people in the church, do we not? But the thing is, in our modern society, there grows an increasing concern that churches really only operate on Sundays. There's even the joke that pastors, we only really work on Sundays anyway. But you see, there's something a little deeper in that criticism, because it makes us think about how we view the church. We can talk about it as being part of God's house, We say that God resides there. And if you want to be a Christian, you'll go to church and meet God. You'll meet Jesus. This is our second and final week studying the early years of Jesus. And through these two lessons, maybe we'll understand something a little different about being in God's presence and understanding what it means to always be in God's house. Our second lesson this morning picks up with Jesus at the kind age of 12 years old. It says that he, his mother, and his father are going to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival of Passover. Now, we will unpack this a bit more when we get into Lent and Holy Week, but a short version of what Passover is all about. It is the greatest festival celebrated by our Jewish brothers and sisters. This is a time where they celebrate the events of the Exodus, the time where they were delivered from oppression in Egypt, taken out of slavery, and brought into a land of their own, where God's promises to them and to their ancestors would be fulfilled. They celebrated the Exodus. And so our reading this morning tells us that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus go to Jerusalem to celebrate this, much like many of their relatives and fellow Jewish people would. Even to this day, it is still a significant holiday, celebrated widely. And so the text tells us they go, and it is their custom, and they follow it. They enjoy all the festivities that are part of this day. And then it says they get ready to leave. So Mary and Joseph are packing up, they're all set to go, and they take off. But they don't see their son. And it's no alarm at first. They assume that, okay, our son is maybe a little farther up in the caravan. Part of that understanding is that the roads at this time are quite dangerous. Robbers and highwaymen are out there looking to ambush small parties or people that are not very well armed, to steal from them what they could, possibly even take their lives. So to prevent this, people would travel in large groups. They would look less like a target and be able to defend themselves a bit better in the event of an attack. So Mary and Joseph are with many relatives and friends doing the same thing, going on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and now returning home. And so they assume that Jesus may be a little farther up, maybe spending time with his friends or relatives, something that even all of us understand. When we travel or go on vacation, if you have people that are used to caring for your children, you don't so much worry. You just have a trust that they'll be fine, that they'll be taking care of them, and that if they act up, they'll be sure to scold them just as much as you would. But as they come to camp for the night, they notice that their son is not with other members of the caravan either, that he's not with them at all. And so they return to Jerusalem and search for their son. It says for 3 days they search, and at the end of those 3 days, they're probably at their wits' end. They haven't been able to find their son. Can you imagine what it must feel like to not know where your child is, in spite of your best efforts? But they continue on and find him in, of all places, the temple courts. And so they go into the temple courts, and they see him sitting there listening attentively to the teachers of the law. And he's listening to them convey information and ask questions, and he's responding. And it's astonishing all those who are witnessing it, including his parents. And so Mary, like a concerned mother, goes up and has a question for her beloved son. And she says to him, "Son, why have you done this? Don't you know your father and I were worried and are anxiously searching for you?" Now I love how Jesus responds to this question, even at a young age. It's a little smart in nature even. He says, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house?" Kids, I advise you not to give that kind of response if you ever run away from home and make your parents worry. I doubt you'll get the same kind of response Jesus did. But so, they go on their way and they return home. And it says Jesus was obedient and grew up favor of God and the people. But how about that response? Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house? My Father's house. The text says that Mary and Joseph didn't understand what this meant. But do we even? Do we understand what Jesus is implying there? What does it mean that he's in his Father's house? Well, luckily there's a couple of things that can help us interpret this. Classic and historic Judaism may look and break down both of those words. Father's house. Well, on the one hand, God is the Father of all nations, the Father of all people, so maybe Jesus is referring to God. And God's house, according to King David and King Solomon, is the temple in Jerusalem. So maybe he's referring to the Jewish temple, which he is currently in when this story is written. But there's a problem with that. Because not 40 years after Jesus' resurrection, in 70 AD, the temple is destroyed by the Romans. After a lot of insurrection in Israel, the Roman armies come in and sack Jerusalem. They destroy the temple and exile the Jewish people from their homeland. It wouldn't be until the events following World War II that Israel would become a sovereign nation again. And to this very day, the area where the temple was is still a contested area as people fight for the right to own that land and to build on it and to restore the temple. If you follow anything in Israel, you know a lot of blood has been shed for that very thing. Moreover, if Jesus is referring to the temple as God's house, the place he will reside, then wouldn't we also assume that a majority of Jesus' ministry would come out of the temple? But instead, when we look at Jesus' activity, at his life and ministry, we see him in the countrysides, traveling, going places here and there. Now, we must acknowledge that he does do a good bit of teaching from the synagogues, and he also does teach from the temple. But a majority of his time, he is out and about, not so much locked into one building or one place. So maybe God's house isn't exclusively talking about the temple. As another way to understand this, how about we look at talking about the church? We often refer to churches as God's house. So how about we look at our own church history to understand this? Well, as a faith, Christianity has had an interesting history over the years with that. Because what a church meant to one person is not universal. Across history, church has meant many things to people. In fact, when we look at the early writers of the New Testament, of Paul and the other apostles, what they mean by church is very different than our own. Because when Paul and the early writers are talking about the churches, when they say the church in Ephesus, the church in Corinth, the church in Rome, they're not talking about steeples and pews and altars. They're not talking about a specific designated building for worship, because their churches are homes. They are a small minority of people. They are not a world religion in the majority. They are a small group just starting out, and they are persecuted. Instead, they meet in homes where they can worship. And their congregations are not 100, 500, 1,000 plus people. No, in the early church, we're talking about maybe, just maybe, 25, 50, at the most 100. They are a small group. Some things changed, though. After enduring the persecution in the 4th century, the Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. And it was at this time that they got the backing to do things and to build buildings specifically for this. Under Emperor Constantine, this was written into law. The Christians couldn't be persecuted. And churches, as we know them, began to erupt and be erected all across Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually later on over here in the United States. And so we see that on our landscape, do we not? You drive down a road and you see church buildings. They seem to have cropped up everywhere. And so began this thing where churches became designated. They would have steeples and pews and preachers and altars, and we began knowing them as God's house, where specific activities would occur. But again, isn't there a limitation in saying that God's presence is linked to a building? Because for that, there's a problem. What do we do when a church closes? What do we do if a church suffers damage from a natural disaster or a fire? If we lose one of the church buildings, do we lose access to God? Moreover, if we think about that, what happens if you can't make it to a church? If you aren't geographically located near one, or you can't physically get to one, are we saying to people that can't come to our church buildings that they can't access God? There's a danger in saying that a building is where God's presence resides. As a third option, let's look at that first lesson about the tale of Simeon and of Anna, to learn what they might have to say about God's presence. Now, an interesting fact about Simeon. He is described as a very devout and religious man. God has given him the Holy Spirit, and God has also revealed by the Holy Spirit that he will see what he has been hoping for his entire life. He will see the Christ child. Can you imagine the agreement he must have had with God? Because it says that he was at a point where he said, God, if you let me see your Messiah, I will go in peace. You can take me, Lord, and I won't put up a fight. And so Simeon was doing a couple things here. Clearly, he knew the promises of the Messiah that were recorded in what we know as the Old Testament, but for the Jewish people, the Hebrew Bible. He knew what the prophets said. He knew what the historical books recorded. He knew God's promises. He committed himself to studying this and knowing what was said about the one who is to come. So on one level, he intellectually knew it. He studied it. He used his mind to do that. But see, mere information wouldn't make him so excited, because clearly he's driven by this desire to see the Messiah. So he's let it go into his heart. He believes it. He has faith in it, enough to be looking for it. So now he's engaging his senses to look for the Messiah. He's got his eyes open, looking for this one. He's got his ears open, listening for those great stories and rumors that the child has been born on earth in Bethlehem. And what's this? He's coming his way now. This is the child. There's his mother and father, Mary and Joseph, and there he is, and he lifts him up into the air in celebration. And that's when he says it. Lord, you can dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, a light of revelation to the Gentiles, and the glorifying of your people Israel. Simeon sees Jesus as a fulfillment of God's presence. That God is now on earth, that God is doing what he has promised through the prophets. And it's all beginning to happen. He is in a state of ecstasy because what he has hoped for, what he had faith in, now has shown up on earth. He has seen a miracle among miracles. So on the one hand, Simeon sees God's presence as a person, as the Messiah, Jesus. Likewise, the story of the prophetess Anna is also interesting on that same kind of level. Because Anna, she's interesting as well. Now it says that she was married. Her and her husband had 7 years together, and then he passed away and she was a widow. At this time, she went and devoted herself to prayer, to fasting, and to worshiping in the temple continually. Day and night, it says in the Bible. Day and night she is worshiping. So think about that. She is logging more hours than the people who work in the temple, than the priests or the scribes, the people that attend the place. She's there more than them because of what God has done through her. As a prophetess, she would have been one that eagerly waited for the Lord to give her a message that she could convey to her people, that she could be an agent of the Lord's message. And she too was eagerly awaiting to see the Messiah. And so when Jesus comes near, she too is in a state of ecstasy, thrilled at what has happened. And so she worships. And then she goes to tell people, but not just anybody. She doesn't go to tell the people who could care less about God. She doesn't go and tell people that have no knowledge of God's promises. She tells people that are excited about God's redemption. That's what it says. She goes and tells people everything she's seen and heard that are excited about God's redemption. It's an interesting thing. I've had the great pleasure of being married to a school teacher these last 6 months. My wife, Kim, if you know anything about teachers, they tend to get up quite early to get a jump start on the day and to get to class before their students. So I have seen many sunrises being married to Kim. So when we see that, I get to see God's great tapestry being painted. The colors of night fading away as hues of yellow, orange, and red, and pink, and all other kinds begin to cascade in the morning. It happens very quickly. As a single man, I try to not see too many of these. Work didn't begin that early, so I wasn't trying to get up super early to see that every day. But I am very thankful that I get to see them, because it makes me think of the other things that God has given me. A new day to celebrate, new opportunities, a new chance to experience something, to go out and help people, to know that I can be fulfilled in many ways. It also makes me think of how privileged I am to have loved ones and family who support me. Whether it's a few miles or hundreds of miles or even oceans that separate us, I know that people care about me. I know that people support me and that see me through good and bad, they're there for me. It makes me think about how fortunate I am to have these people in my life. A little bit more locally, there's church family. That with all of you, each week we celebrate a time of joys and concerns, a time where we share things that are great celebrations and also things that weigh upon our hearts and minds. To know that at the drop of a hat, if I just give a phone call or send an email, instantly people are knocking on heaven's door with that request, whether it be a celebration or a concern. My friends, it makes me think about how God is available. That God's presence abides everywhere, not just in a building. I don't need to just be in church to be able to worship the Lord. I can worship God at those sunrises when I take a moment to give him thanks for everything he's done in times past and for this new day. And nobody's watching. Nobody needs to be a part of that. I can give thanks to God when I'm out there grocery shopping, doing something very menial, but still to say, God, I'm thankful that I live in a place where I can buy things with this money that you've let me earn. I can have food and a variety at that. I can have clean water out of my tap at home and all kinds of tasty beverages with hot chocolates and coffees and teas. I can give thanks to God in so many ways, and I can feel his presence, not just in one place, because friends, let's be honest, thanks be to God that the Lord's presence isn't limited to one location. Thanks be to God that he's everywhere. That no matter what, we can experience the Lord. because he is so mighty and so great. So maybe, after looking at all these things, the lesson to be learned is that God's house is great. It's just not one church. It's not all the churches. It's not all the earth even. It's everything. We can always be in the presence of the Lord if we but take the chance, take the opportunity to focus ourselves and be in His presence. So today, friends, I invite you to take that step. To take the opportunities to be in God's house at all times and in all places. To know that He is eager to welcome you home. He's eager to see you come through that door. He's eager when you take a moment to be with Him. Because He's eager to see you. He's eager to say, "Welcome home, my child. How are you doing?" Take that time to be in God's presence, not just on Sundays, but each and every day. Welcome home, dear friends. Welcome home.